Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel and thank you so much for clicking on this video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a 16,000 mile valve clearance on your Honda Africa Twin and hopefully save you a lot of money instead of taking it to the dealership and having this done. So stay tuned. Alright guys, once again, thanks so much for clicking on this video. Real quick, take a second, hit that subscribe button as well as that bell icon. That way you know when new videos like this are released. So now when it comes to maintenance, we all know how important maintenance is for our motorcycles and for maintaining them so that they last a long time. Now if you own a Honda, you know that these motorcycles are built really well and they're really known for having low maintenance. Now the Honda Africa Twin says at 16,000 miles or 25,600 kilometers, you need to check your valve clearance. I will say a lot of guys go and they don't do this and it's totally fine for miles and miles after, but Honda recommends that for a reason. So now it's really up to you if you decide to do it at 16,000 miles or you wait until maybe you have a problem. In my opinion, doing maintenance is really important, especially for preventative measures, so you don't have any problems down the road. Now I know that there's guys who have gone thousands and thousands and thousands of miles over that 16,000 mark. They go in there and they check and it's perfectly in spec, and that's great. But the problem is if you don't check it and you do have a problem and it needs to be adjusted, not adjusting that could lead to bigger issues and also performance issues down the road with your motorcycle. So that being said, in this video, I'm going to show you how to check that valve clearance on your bike with just some simple hand tools, maybe a shop manual. It's not totally necessary if you use this video as a guide, but a shop manual is a good tool to have. And also, you're going to want to use a micrometer. It's one of these tools you absolutely have to be able to check the shims that are in there. You can pick them up from Harbor Freight really cheap, and in my experience, the ones from Harbor Freight are really accurate, so it's not like you have to go and spend a bunch of money on some special tools to be able to make this work. The biggest thing out of this is if you take it to a dealer, it's going to cost way more than it would be for your own time, which is essentially free, and just a few hand tools that you might have to buy if you don't already own them to make this work. One item that you also might want to pick up if you plan on keeping your motorcycle for a long time is a Hot Cams shim kit. Now the shims are used underneath the valves to be able to get your clearances right, and I'll show you this later on in the video where these come into play. This kit here costs about $80, but you don't have to buy the entire kit to be able to do this. You can actually, after you check them, then go to your dealer and pick up the shims individually. The problem with that is you just have to wait for the downtime for the shims to ship. I work on a lot of different bikes, a lot of Hondas in general, so picking up the shim kit will pay for itself down the road. So I just bought the kit. It's about 89 bucks, I believe, the last time I checked. And you have a plethora of shims to be able to go in and use whenever you need them instead of having to wait. But again, if you have the time and you have the patience to be able just to buy the shims that you need if you need them, then that is also a way cheaper option because they will cost maybe a buck or two versus the entire kit. Anyway, that being said, we're going to go over to the motorcycle and I'll show you what we do here to get started. Now over here at the bike, there are a few things that you have to do to get started, obviously, to be able to get into the bike where, you know, the top of the motor is. First thing you're going to do is you're going to want to remove the seat. You're going to want to remove any crash bars if you have crash bars, your side panels, and remove your tank. Now, I'm not going to show you how to do a lot of this because if you've done air filter cleaning on your own, then you already know how to remove the side panels. We should know how to do that if we're maintaining our motorcycles properly. And then I will show you how to do a few things for removing the tank as far as removing some of the connectors. And then we'll dive in to the top of the motor and what we need to do to be able to prep before we start digging too far in the top of the motor. So we'll go ahead and do that and I'll be right back with you. Okay, so we got all of our side panels off, we got our crash bars off. Now we're ready to remove the gas tank. If you own a Honda Africa Twin, which I'm assuming you do, because why else would you be watching this video, you know that just to get to this step, to check the air filters or to remove the gas tank is a giant pain in the ass. So if you've made it to this point and you're like, F it, I don't want to do anymore, I'm going to take it to the dealer, now's a good time to probably do that. If not, and you want to continue on and work on your own motorcycle, go ahead and follow with me and we'll keep going. Okay, so at this point, in order to remove the gas tank, we need to get to the bolt that's directly under this seat latch. In order to remove this seat latch, there are two 10 millimeter bolts, one here and one here. They were a little bit tricky to get to, and really the best thing to do is use a extension and a ratchet with a 10 millimeter socket. I use this Milwaukee battery powered ratchet. I love this thing. It saves a ton of time, but we're gonna go ahead and remove those. Best thing to do is just kind of put it at here at an angle to get to these, break them free, and pull them loose. Now, you want to apply a little bit of pressure when you fish these out, because if you don't, you'll drop them down in between the tank and the frame, and unless you have a magnet, sometimes they're a pain to get out. Just easy like that. That's one. We'll do the same thing on the other side. This one's not so bad because now the bracket's movable and you fish that one out. Now this bracket will just move freely and you can get to this bolt. You can remove it completely by removing this bolt and removing the mechanism. Either way, it's up to you. If you want more room, you can definitely remove it. If you're wondering what this is a Dynajet Power Commander 5. I do have uni filters in my air filters, and I have a full Akrapovic exhaust with the header and everything. So I was running really rich by doing that. They say you don't have to change your fuel curves, but that's complete BS. If you want the bike to get all the power you can out of those modifications, you got to change the fuel curve. So I run a Power Commander and I now get roughly 100 horsepower, which makes a huge difference in the performance of this motorcycle. But there's more on that in other videos. I did go ahead and remove this mechanism here. When you do remove this, I'd like to show you, this is the mechanism that you get after you remove this bolt from the bracket. Be careful, there is a spring inside here. It won't go flying unless you really mess with this, but this is the latch for the seat. So just carefully place it off to the side so you don't lose that spring in there. From here, all we're gonna do is remove this bolt and the tank will lift up, and I'll show you up underneath some connections you need to remove. Okay, so under the fuel tank here, there are a few connections we need to remove. One is going to be the main fuel line here from the fuel sending unit. This has a little gray safety clip on it. You just push this over and down, and I'm not sure I can do this with one hand, but you're gonna wanna push this in this way, like squeeze it, push it in just to give a little bit of pressure off, and then you're gonna, while pressing this gray button in, then release. There will be a tiny bit of fuel that pops out, but not much. The other thing you're gonna wanna do is you have some vacuum and fuel or event hoses. You're gonna wanna remove those. I do have a Camel tank right here, a auxiliary, auxiliary fuel tank. So I am actually using one of my vent hoses as a feed line for that. The last thing you're gonna wanna remove is your fuel gauge electronics here, and it's simple by just simply pressing this and disconnecting it. Once those are all undone, then you can remove the fuel tank, and I'll go ahead and do that now. Go ahead and set my light in here. I'm gonna see if I can just show you how to remove this. Let's see if I can get this on camera. It's pretty focused. Okay, so again, this little gray clip here, just move it over and push it in. And again, you're gonna just put a little bit of pressure on it, push in, and then just kind of work it loose. And that's it. And like I said, a little bit of fuel, not much, comes out and you're good to go. All you're doing is you're releasing the pressure to get it over this little edge right here. Now, this is a electronic pump, so when you move this gas tank, a bunch of fuel isn't gonna pour out of there. You might lose a couple drops, but not much. So don't freak out about this. At the same time, you don't wanna force it or pry it. This is all plastic, and if you break this, you're kind of screwed until you can get another piece. So again, don't force this too much. Okay, so at this point we have our tank removed, and this is gonna show our air box, our throttle bodies, and all the electronics that sit on top of the motor. Now this would be a really good time if you don't like a lot of dirt to go through and clean all this off. I ride in dusty environments constantly, so all that builds up on top of the motor. And it would be a really good time to clean all this off, mainly because you are gonna have the top of the motor, the cover exposed, or the internals of the top of the motor exposed. So you would like to keep any dust you can out of there. Be aware though, if you are gonna do that, make sure and cap off any hoses or electrical connections that you might be exposed if you're gonna, you know, hose this down. Everything on this motor is pretty much waterproof, but you definitely want to, any vent hoses and electrical connections, you want to make sure and keep those covered because you don't want water getting into those. From here, what we're going to do to remove the air box is we will remove this bolt here that is right here by the steering neck, as well as loosen these connections to remove the intake tubes, and this whole air box will come off. From there, we're going to remove the ignition coil tray, and that is also fairly simple. Basically, you're just going to remove all or disconnect all of your electrical connections, and there's a few fasteners that hold it on, and we will lift that out as well to expose the top of the motor. One more quick thing, if you do have a shop manual and you're looking for some step-by-steps on this, page 10.5 and 5.9 will get your air box and the ignition coil cover off, or the ignition tray off rather, to get you to the top of the motor. Just a little bit of FYI there. Okay, so making progress. We have our air box removed, and I went ahead and put some paper towels down inside the intake. You don't want junk and dirt and everything else falling down inside there, so make sure and protect that. Now, we are almost to our cylinder head cover. We have our ignition coil tray here, and really to remove this, it's a bit of a process, not too bad. There's just a lot of little connections that you have to mess with. One being removing the spark plug boots. Now, each cylinder has 2 spark plugs, so you have to be able to get to those to remove those. And you know, this bike is very compact. They want to keep all the weight as low as possible, and by doing that, to work on them doesn't make it that easy. So in order to remove the spark plug boots and get the spark plugs out of the way so we can later on turn the engine over to top dead center to check the valve clearance, we need to loosen the radiators. And to do that, there are 2 bolts right along the neck of the frame, 2 on each side, 2 on this side and 2 on the other side. We'll remove those, and the radiator will literally just kind of fall out of the way. And then from there, we'll be able to unplug all of our boots and then remove this tray right here. Again, kind of a process, but this is why this particular valve clearance check costs so much at the dealer. Don't quote me on this, but I've heard people say it's somewhere in the range of like $600 or more to be able to have this done. So going in there and doing it yourself, even though it does take a little bit of time, and like I said, a little bit of patience, it will save you a lot of money in the long run. So over here on this side of the motor, I got the radiator loose, remove all the connections in this little plastic shroud here. And you may not have to remove all of this stuff, but for demonstration purposes here, I just want to be able to see you have one spark plug right in here, and right there, and then you have another one. Okay, so I'm at the point here where I have my throttle bodies out and my ignition tray out. I just went ahead and laid the throttle body over, just kind of out of the way. Didn't want to remove the cables and all that good stuff. But just, again, be patient when you're pulling all this stuff out. There is a ton of connections. And if you're not real good with remembering where things go, it might even be a good idea to take some pictures. Just so it's easy to remember which plugins go where. Most of these are almost all idiot proof because they only plug in, you only plug one into each one. So there's no way to get them mixed up for the most part. But just, again, remember kind of where things go and to take your time. Also, just remember when putting all this all back together, there will be a couple of connections back here on the front of the motor. Just don't forget about those, because if you do, then you'll have some electrical issues, obviously, with them not running correctly. So now, next thing we're going to do is go in here and remove these top bolts for the valve cover itself. This is maybe a little bit better view from the right side of the bike here. You've got one there, and one there. To go ahead and remove. These are all 10 millimeter. And again, wipe all this stuff off before you remove it. You don't want any dust or junk falling down in there. And like I did before, just take your paper towels and shove them down inside your intake tubes so no dust and stuff falls down inside there as well. All right, so step 197. No, just joking, but that's what it feels like to get to this point. So we got our 3 bolts removed. You will lift up on the valve cover and it will come out this way. Just kind of feed it through you know, the wires and everything you have here, or sorry, the hoses you have here. Not that difficult at all. The hardest part really is getting it up over the stems where the front spark plugs are, and then just kind of fishing it up and around there. So now here we are to the fun part, the whole reason that we started this, and it's to check the valve clearance. Here's your intake, and on the other side here is your exhaust. Now what we're going to do first is check cylinder 1. Cylinder 1 is on this side, and in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to line the timing mark on the motor on this side here, and I'll show you that here in a second. But we're going to align that so that the intake valve is at T1. Here's a better look. So what's unique about the Honda Africa Twin is that on the intake side, you've got shims on your cam and on your lifters, and then on this other side, you have the traditional tappet adjusters. So the cool thing about that is, yes, you do have to adjust shims on this side if one is out of spec, but on this one, it's a really easy exhaust adjustment by just loosening that nut, adjusting that tappet, and getting it in the right clearance. So anyway, back to what we were doing. We're gonna rotate the motor around. We remove the inspection covers, and this is a little better with some light. So inside here is a 17 millimeter nut. We're gonna take a socket and a ratchet, and we're going to rotate the motor around counterclockwise until in this hole here we can see a timing mark. You see one little dash there, but there's going to be a mark on the flywheel there, and we're going to align it with this little mark here where it says T1. So I'm going to go ahead and put the camera down and do that for you, and then I'll show you. Really quick, here is a quick little illustration of what I was talking about, and I will show you on the motor itself. But again, we're going to rotate the motor around until T1 lines with that, and then also on our cam there'll be two little marks, and again I'll show you that in real time here on the motor, but this is what we're shooting for to get the first intake checked. Okay, so the reason I wanted to show you in the book versus showing you in real life here on this inspection hole here, you can see there's a T, and then maybe there's a 1 underneath it. Hard to see with the camera, but it's a little bit different than what the book actually illustrates. So I just wanted to show you this difference. Okay, so another little illustration here just to show you. So it says number 1 cylinder intake valve clearance is 0.16 plus or minus 0.03 millimeters. And again, you can always measure this in inches, but millimeters always seems to be a little bit easier to measure. Okay, this is a little bit better view, and we're gonna go ahead and measure our intake side over here on cylinder 1. So this is the intake. These are the 2 intake lobes. This is cylinder 1, and you can see that the lobes are actually facing the rear of the bike, and you can see the bucket down in there just a little bit. So what we're going to do, the spec, again, like I said, is 0.16 plus or minus 0.03. So we're going to take our feeler gauge. This is not going to focus, but just trust me that this is 0.15. So we're going to go ahead and measure first and see if this will slide down inside there. And it does. That one slides in there fairly simple, as well as that one. So we'll go a little bit bigger and see if a maybe 0.18 will fit. Try to get my hand in behind here so you can see. So 0.18. 0.18 fits nice and smooth. Actually hardly any friction at all there, so we'll go a little bit bigger. 0.19 would be our next one up, and that would be at the top of our spec there. So let's go ahead and do 0.20. That if 0.20 fits, that means that the intake will be out of spec, and we'll see where we need to be at from there. So 0.20. 0.20 slides in. Again, really easy. So it looks like with this bike, it is going to be out of spec on the intake side. A little bit tighter on the other intake. So because we're out of spec, what we're going to want to do is measure the largest one that we can fit in there and write that number down. That way we know what adjustments we need to make to get it back into spec. So let's bump up to 0.25. This will be quite a bit out of spec. Man, 2.25 does actually still fit in there, which is pretty incredible. That would make it way out of spec, which this motorcycle was running really well, so I'm kind of surprised that it's as far off as what it shows. So 0.25 will not fit in this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some paper, we'll write our measurements down for the first intake, and we'll go from there. Okay, so I've measured cylinder 1 here. I ended up getting 0.21 on this one and 0.26 on this one. So they are clearly way out of spec, so we'll have to make some adjustments there. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to measure cylinder 2 lobes. So we'll go ahead and we'll rotate the motor around to where the indicator mark is at T2. Okay, now we are at T2, and you can see that the lobes are now facing towards the rear of the bike. On the side of the cam, there is a little dot now instead of dashes, and it looks just about like that. Hard to see in the photo, but it's just a little indent on there. So now instead of using the 2 dashes on the side of the cam, there is just a dot. Basically, when you're at T1, you rotate it around 270 degrees and you get T2. Again, as long as these 2 are facing towards the rear of the bike, you're in the right position. So let's go ahead and measure those now. Now, since cylinder 1 was way off in the gap, we'll go ahead and start big here and see where we are on the top end of that measurement. So let's go ahead and start with 0.20 and see if we are on or off. It's fairly snug. I'd say that's probably about where we would want to be as far as snugness goes. So that one is also off at 0.20. And then this one, it does not fit, so we'll go a little bit lower. That one will probably be in spec because 0.19 would be at the top end. So let's go ahead and drop down to, let's say 0.18 and see if that fits. Again, just trying to see if it's actually within that 0.03 plus or minus. 0.03 or 0.18 does not fit there. So this one will totally be in spec unless it's tight. So let's go ahead and keep measuring. 5, that is just below where they want it to be. And that fits nice, and that little bit of drag that you're looking for. So I would say it's either exactly on or just a little bit tight. I mean, we're talking barely, but it's still within spec. So we'll go ahead and remember that. But again, this one here is out of spec, and we'll go ahead and annotate that now on our paper. Okay, so we've written down our intake for cylinder 2. And now in this position, we can also measure our exhaust valves on cylinder 2. And the spec for this is 0.23 millimeters plus or minus 0.02 millimeters. So with this one, like I said, they're a little bit different. So instead of measuring the bucket, we're going to measure right in between our cam lobe and this roller on both here and here. So we'll start with 0.23 and see if we're in spec there on the exhaust. So over here on cylinder 2, we'll measure right in between here and see if they're on. 0.23 does not go into that one. Nor does it, it goes into here a little. Yep, 0.23 fits in to this right side. Nice and snug. 0.23 does not go into that one. So we'll go ahead and say that this one is just fine. Let's go ahead and drop it down just a little bit. 0.20 would put us out of spec because it would be outside that 0.02 plus or minus. But let's just see if it fits. And it does fit nice and snug with a little bit of drag there. So go ahead and say that that one is just barely out of spec, so we'll have to raise that one up. We'll go ahead and make that, make those annotations now, and we'll move on to the last exhaust side. So to check this last exhaust side, we're going to want to go ahead and rotate the motor around to where it says E1, which stands for exhaust cylinder 1, and there is a little arrow on here just to make sure you're in the right spot. So we'll go ahead and rotate that around, and we'll measure the last exhaust side on cylinder 1. Okay, so we got our motor rotated around to the E1 mark. We have our arrow on the cam sprocket rather, and then we have the first exhaust one here, and then the second exhaust one is right here. And you'll know that your cam is in the right position because all of your dots are facing up. The cam lobe is not actually touching anything, so we're good there. So we'll go ahead and measure between here and here. So we'll go ahead and start with the 0.23 millimeters. Go ahead and slide it right in between here. Rolls nice through there, maybe a little bit loose. Does not fit on the far side. So 0.25 on this one would put us at the very top of our spec. It fits just a little bit snug. So we know we're going to have to adjust these two here. And again, these are way easier to adjust because all we have to do is adjust our tappets. But we'll go ahead and indicate where we are, and then we'll start making our adjustments on our intake side. Okay, so here we have our intake side measurements on cylinder 1 and cylinder 2, and our exhaust measurements on cylinder 1 and cylinder 2. Now again, the exhaust measurements can be adjusted fairly easy, and I'll show you that later. It's not near as complicated as what the intake side is, and really it's not that complicated either. But what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to remove the camshaft covers, remove the camshaft, and then we'll have to do some measuring here. Now, A is going to be our new shim size, and to find that, what we do is we take our specified or our measured value minus the specific value of what it's supposed to be, plus the old shim size. And this will all make sense once we start getting into that, but what we'll go ahead and do now is I'll go ahead and remove the camshaft, and we'll start removing the buckets. All right, guys, good morning. It's another day. Went out and did this last night until about 2 a.m. And once I got my measurements and knew that I was going to have to be removing the camshaft and doing some measuring and some math, decided to go ahead and call it a night and get up the next day, and we're working on it again. So I started the project at about 11 o'clock last night and ended at about 2. So it took me about 3 hours to get to this point. If you're wondering just about how long it takes in real time to get here, it might take you a little quicker because you're not going to be filming when you're doing this. It might even take you longer if you haven't done anything like this in the past or before. So just know that it's going to take you roughly 3 hours just to get to this point right here. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the rocker arms on the exhaust side, as well as these caps that hold on the camshaft. Remove the camshaft, and that way we can get down to the buckets to be able to check our shims. Before we do any unbolting here, we're going to get it back to top dead center, or the T1 mark over here on the side of the motor, and that way everything is timed correctly when we start to pull all this stuff off. So apparently my microphone died here, so really all I've got going on here is I've got it back to the top dead center, the T1 mark. Both of my lobes are facing to the rear, so I know that it's timed correctly. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these rocker arms. There's a bolt here and then one on the other side here. You remove that to slide the rocker arm shaft out, and then once I've done that, I'll remove the rocker arm shaft and the rocker arms, and then remove the caps for the camshaft. Once I've done that, I'll remove the cam chain sprocket as well as the cam chain tensioner, and remove the camshaft itself to reveal the buckets. On the left side of the motor, there is this plug that you'll be removing with a 6mm Allen wrench, I believe, and then that's going to expose your rocker arm shaft. You'll take a 6mm bolt and just thread it into that shaft, and then from there just apply a little bit of tension and pulling it out, and that should slide right out of that hole. Here on the workbench you can see these two indentation marks. That's where the bolts go in that keep it aligned. Just remember, whenever you slide this back in, to make sure those align with the holes of the bolts that you removed so you can align it properly. Now that my microphone's on and you got to hear that little bit of a voiceover on that last part, we're gonna go ahead and pull our rocker arms out now. So they should all be loose. I'm gonna reach in here and just lift them out. Trying to keep them in order just to make things easier for installation. They are marked with a with numbers 1, not sure if it'll focus, 2, and then you have, this is a B. This also has a B on it, but on this side, it's got a 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So you know which side goes where. Okay, so now that our rocker arms are removed, the next thing we're gonna do is remove these caps. But before we do that, we need to rotate the motor again over to the T2 mark. And once we've done that, then we can start removing the cam chain tensioner, the cam sprocket, and then these caps. Okay, so the next thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna take the tension off of our cam chain with our cam chain tensioner here. Now this has an automatic cam chain tensioner, it's spring loaded. There's a cap on here. So what we're gonna do is we're going to remove this bolt and we're going to release some of the tension that's on there and then remove our other bolts. Now, Honda says that you have to have a special tool to be able to do this. That is, it is true, it makes it easier if you do have a special tool, but a very small screwdriver going down in here and turning it clockwise will help secure this and move the whole thing out. So I'll show you how that's done. So first thing we'll do is we'll take our 8mm wrench, we'll loosen this bolt up here and remove it. Again, there is a washer on this, so be careful not to lose the sealing washer, or you could potentially have it leak. Set this off to the side. So as I mentioned, the book says you have to have a special tool to hold this, to remove it. That's not necessarily the case. What's going on in here is there is a spring that is pushing the chain up against there. What they're asking you to do is relieve that tension, lock it down, and then remove it. I'm going to show you that you can actually do this without that special tool and get this removed just by loosening these bolts up. The trick is going to be putting it, when you put it back on, it can be a little bit more difficult, but it's totally doable without that tool. Just want to be sure that whenever you do remove it, just to kind of take the tension off evenly. This one doesn't seem like it's too bad. So we'll go ahead and remove the bolts, and then we'll go ahead and just kind of rock this back and forth. And it just comes right out. Now see this plunger on here.
So one thing I want to mention is this metal cap right here on the end of the plunger. Be very careful when you remove this out of the motor because it can actually come off and drop down inside the motor.
This plunger on here, it can be adjusted by putting a screwdriver in and rotating it. And it ends up sucking it down inside there. I don't know if you can see it getting shorter, just like that. Now, putting this back in can be a little bit of a pain.
And I say that because you have to rotate this with a screwdriver counterclockwise and hold it to keep it in the compressed position while you insert it to then tighten it up without releasing it so that it doesn't apply too much tension to the chain when you tighten the chain tensioner down.
Check your gasket, make sure it's not torn, because if it is, you're gonna want to replace this gasket. A lot of times I say replace gaskets no matter what, but this one's actually in really good shape. So if you don't have one on hand, you can probably get by with reusing it. If you do have the time, go ahead and order a new one and get one put on there. So yeah, we'll go ahead and set this off to the side. Now that we've got that cam chain tensioner removed, our cam chain is nice and loose in there. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove these 4 bolts, these 6 bolts, and we're gonna remove them nice and easy, kind of in a cross pattern, loosening them up across the shaft here. Instead of just removing one cap at a time, we wanna make sure and loosen evenly across here, just so there's no warping of this aluminum. It's very rare that would happen, but it's definitely something that you would not want to happen, so we'll go ahead and do it as the book says. These are very tight, and you are in aluminum, so like I mentioned, you just want to make sure that you are taking as much care as possible to not ruin the top end of your motor. Those are all loose now, so we can go ahead and remove each one of these caps. So we got our bolts removed. Now these caps are a little bit of a pain to get off because there's not a whole lot to grab onto, and there is a dowel pin in each one of these. See here? Now you have to kind of lift up on them. Just do yourself a favor and do not use a screwdriver to like pry up on these, because if you mar this surface or happen to break into this, not a good thing. So just reach your fingers in there, rock it back and forth, and they'll come out. So now you'll notice over here on this side of the motor, we have our cam chain sprocket. What we're gonna do now is we have to remove these bolts, but you can see that one's accessible and one's not. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna rotate the motor just slightly to where we can remove this bolt, and then rotate it back so that our timing marks and everything all line up. And then we'll remove this one. That way your motor is all still in the correct position when you put it all back together. So we'll go ahead and remove those now. So I got the first bolt out. I'm getting ready to remove the second one. You want to take extreme care to not drop these bolts down inside the motor. That would be very bad. Another thing you might want to do, and I'm going to do here, is take some wire and I'm going to loop it through one of these holes up to the frame to keep the sprocket from also falling down in there. Once we have our camshaft, or our cam sprocket rather, secured over here with the wire, I can then just reach in here, lift up on the camshaft, and remove it. And again, we'll set this aside. Okay, we are finally to the point where we can get to our shim buckets. Our shim buckets are here, as you can see. And what we're gonna do now is take a magnet, reach in here with your magnet, give a little wiggle, and your bucket will come off right here. And you can see right on top there, right there on top, is your shim underneath the bucket. Take our magnet and remove our shim. Right there. Set these off to the side and do the same for all the other intake ones. Sometimes you get lucky and when you pull it out, you'll get your shim right in the bucket as well. Just be careful, because if it does do that and you don't realize it and you drop it, that sucks. And now we have all of our buckets removed with all of our shims. We'll take this over to the workbench and we'll finally get our measurements. All right, so we have all of our parts from the top of the motor here. We've got our buckets and our shims. I'm not sure this will show up. All of these say 198 on them. So from the factory, these come with a 1.98 shim. Just because it says 1.98 doesn't mean that it's still 1.98. So you're gonna wanna take your caliper or your micrometer, either one, and you're gonna wanna measure these. So this one says 1.97, not 1.98. The next one, also 1.97. This one is 1.98, and this one is 1.98. Just in case you didn't see it the first time. Just because they say 1.98 on them doesn't necessarily mean it's still 1.98. So once again, here's our formula. We have our new shim size equals our measured value minus the spec value plus the thickness of the shim. So we'll go ahead and write this down. I bet if you've never done this before, you did not probably realize that there was math involved. So we'll just do cylinder 1 and this first one here. So A equals the measured value, which is 0.21, minus the specified value on this was 0.16, plus our shim, which was 1.98. And we'll do that math. So 0.21 minus 0.16, 0.04. 0.05. So A equals 0.05 plus 1.98, making our new shim size 2.03. Here's a little bit better view of that. Now we'll do that same thing for every other intake valve. Okay, so we're looking for that 0.16 mark for the intake. Right now with this 2.03, that would give us exactly 0.16. The problem is, when you have a shim kit, or you know that shims only come in certain sizes, the closest one is either 2.0 or 2.05. In this case, the 2.05 is going to work better for us, because if you just kind of do the reverse math with this and you enter that in, you would get 0.14, and that's within the spec, and it's a little bit on the tight side, but I'd rather be a little bit on the tight side than on the loose side, because that allows the valve to open up the specified amount that it's supposed to, and then also give you some time for wear. So we'll go ahead and use the 2.05 shim for this first one, and we'll continue on the same process throughout the next of the intakes. Now obviously, once you get all the correct shims and get it all back together, you definitely want to go back and recheck all of your clearances, just to make sure that either one, your math was right, or two, your measurements with your feeler gauges were correct. I'm going to sit here and not have you watch me do all of these, so I'm going to go ahead, measure all this stuff out, get everything reassembled, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, so at this point, I've got my camshaft back in, I've got my caps on. They're not torqued down yet, they're just snug. And then I've got my cam sprocket back on, and I'm still in that T2 position. So now what I can do is I can check cylinder 2. I can then rotate the motor around to T1, check the T1 side, and then we'll go back to T2 and we'll put all our exhaust valves if no other adjustments need to be on or need to be adjusted. The biggest thing here is you want to make sure that your math is correct and that your measurements were correct or close whenever you use your feeler gauges. So this will give you, before putting the entire top end back together, it just gives you an opportunity to check and make sure that you are now within spec before going any further, and then you can go back and tighten everything down where it needs to be. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I've rechecked everything, and we are now back in spec. So now what I can do is I can go and I can start torquing down these bolts. Now the torque spec on those, 12 Newton meters or 9 foot-pounds. So we'll go ahead and set our torque wrench to 12 Newton meters, and we'll go ahead and torque those down. And again, they need to be torqued down in a crisscross pattern. So we'll do that. And then from here, we'll go ahead and reinstall our exhaust rocker arms, and we'll make our exhaust valve adjustments at this point. We also want to make sure and torque our cam sprocket bolts. So those are to 20 Newton meters, and we're going to want to apply some thread locker, so some blue Loctite on those before we do that. So now that we got all this torqued down and we have our cam sprocket torqued down, we are now going to rotate the motor over to the T1 mark, and we'll go ahead and install all of our exhaust rocker arms. Now with it in this T1 mark, we can take our rocker arm, we can get it in the right position going from left to right, because the shaft needs to drive in from left to right. Just go ahead and drop it down in there, and then work the shaft all the way one by one on the way through. You have to make sure and get the motor in the T1 mark. That way all the exhaust valves at this point are closed. Once you get those rocker arms installed, remember the position of that shaft. You want to make sure that the indentation marks are lined up with the hole so you can get the bolt down inside there. Go ahead and tighten these down, and then we'll torque them to that 12 Newton meters. You can make your adjustments a couple ways. On the rocker arms themselves, you'll notice that there is a little nut and a tappet adjuster. This is a neat little tool right here where you've got a little square end on it, and this goes right over the tappet. You can break the nut free and then do your adjustments here, or you could also just use a pair of needle nose pliers and a wrench to make your adjustments. Either way, they both work. So on exhaust E1 or cylinder 1, we'll go ahead and check those. The spec on that is 0.23 plus or minus 2. So all we're gonna do was we're gonna break this nut free and then use our adjuster to loosen or tighten depending on what we need. And again, you can do this with an 8mm wrench, or you can use this tool. I'm gonna take my feeler gauge at that 0.23, slide it in here, and then make my adjustment to where it's just snug. You can see it, maybe you can see, probably not. A little bit of that bar is in the way. But I'm making the adjustment with my fingertips. Screwing it in makes it tighter. Out, obviously looser. And I want to just snug it up to where I get a little bit of drag, but don't have to just kind of force it in between the two lobes. Right in there is good. Go ahead and hold that top piece tight and snug it up. After I snug it, go ahead and recheck, make sure we're still in spec. Now I'm gonna do that exact same thing for the other 3 exhaust valves, and I'll have to rotate the motor over to T2 to be able to do the second cylinder exhaust. After checking your exhaust valves, really the only thing left you have to do is to put it back together. One thing that I encourage you to do is once you get your cam chain tensioner in, go ahead and rotate the motor around a couple times. Make sure nothing is binding or anything like that. If you want, finally go back and one more time, maybe check your exhaust and your intake valves. Totally up to you. But at this point, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna install the valve cover and really just start putting everything back together. I'm not gonna video all that because literally it just goes on the way that it came back in. There are a few torque specifications, and I can leave all that stuff down in the description below. But other than that, guys, this is a service that you can do for yourself that takes, it does take a lot of time, but it does save you a ton of money in the long run. And I encourage you, if you have a little bit of mechanical ability and some hand tools, you can totally do this yourself and save yourself a trip from having to go to the dealership and drop in $600 or $700 or however much it costs to get this done. Guys, that being said, thank you so much for hanging through all this, checking out this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and make sure and hit that subscribe button as well as that bell icon. That way you know when other videos like this are released. I'm gonna get all this back together. Guys, thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.